Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. People who've experienced the paranormal or seen cryptids and other unknown creatures. What's your story? Story 1. Ghost in the Basement.
After my father passed away, I went to stay with my friend and his mother for a while. Things with my mother were strained, and though I was reluctant to leave home, they did not want me to be alone during that time. Staying at anyone else's house always made me uneasy, but I had no choice. My first night there, I woke up early to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open. A man in a red flannel shirt and bib denim overalls stepped inside, carrying a worn leather bag of tools. His movements were calm and deliberate. He turned on the light, casting long shadows across the room, and glanced in my direction. I froze, unsure if I was dreaming. Without a word, he walked through another doorway into what appeared to be a utility room. The door shut quietly behind him. I must have drifted off again because when I woke up, the room was pitch black, just as it had been when I went to sleep. Confused, I replayed the encounter in my head, convincing myself I had imagined it. The next morning, over coffee, I casually asked my friend's mother, "Does the man in overalls still come by?" "He went into the utility room last night." Her face fell. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I described the man in detail, his height, build, the faded flannel shirt, and the tools. Her expression turned to one of pure terror. She stood up abruptly, disappeared into her bedroom, and returned clutching an old yellowed photograph. "Is this him?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I stared at the photo in shock. It was him, even down to the same clothes. "That is my grandfather," she said, her voice barely audible. "He has been gone for over 30 years. She explained that he had owned the farm and, during a financial crisis, made a devastating choice. On a stormy night, he carried a lightning rod into the middle of the pond. Lightning struck, killing him instantly. His death ensured the family's survival. The insurance money saved the farm from foreclosure. That night, lying in the same room, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. Somewhere in the silence, I swore I heard the faint creak of a door opening.
Story 2. Child in room 234.
In our small town county hospital, rooms 123 and 234 have always felt off. The building, constructed in the 1970s, is unremarkable. No tragic history, no gruesome accidents. We do not take traumatic cases, and when we lose patients, it is usually from natural causes. Yet these two rooms, especially 234, harbor a secret I cannot ignore. I do not believe in the supernatural. As someone who identifies as an agnostic atheist, I have always sought logical explanations. But something keeps happening in these rooms, something I cannot rationalize. It starts with the prisoners. Our prison wing has been active for 8 years, and while most inmates pass quietly from natural causes, the ones in 234 often speak of a child. It is always the same. Right before they die, in a haze of delirium, they mention a child in the room. Sometimes they mutter about a boy hiding under their bed. Other times they claim he is running circles around them, laughing and mocking them. It is not just the delirious inmates. Mentally altered offenders, not under the influence of drugs, but those with genuine cognitive disorders, have reacted violently to this unseen child. One man screamed for hours, thrashing so wildly that we had to transfer him back to his unit earlier than planned. Even the lucid inmates, those of sound mind, have mentioned hearing children's voices. One swore he heard what sounded like a child's television show playing through the wall. But I keep my hallways quiet. Televisions are barely audible, and no children ever visit this wing. The scariest part: this phenomenon is never discussed among staff. We do not share ghost stories with inmates, and they come from different units across the region. Yet they all describe the same thing. I try to dismiss it, chalk it up to the stress of the job, but every time I pass those rooms, I feel the air shift. It is heavier, colder, and sometimes when the lights are dim and the hallways silent, I swear I hear it too. A faint, playful giggle, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. Whatever it is not leaving.
Story 3. The little girl under the blanket.
My dad's house always felt wrong. It was more than just creaky floorboards or dim lighting. Almost everyone who stepped inside, myself, my siblings, and even my dad, had experienced something unexplainable. One weekend, when I was about 6 years old, I had an encounter I will never forget. I was upstairs, heading for a shower. The bathroom was at the end of a long hallway, past the room I shared with my sisters during weekend visits. As I walked by the open door to our room, something caught my eye. I froze mid-step and slowly turned my head. On the bottom bunk of our bed, something was sitting up. At first, I thought it was one of my sisters, but as I focused, my stomach dropped. It wasn't them. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a little girl. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her short black hair was perfectly cut in a bob with straight bangs that framed her face. But it was her eyes that paralyzed me. They were impossibly large, massive, unblinking circles with dark pupils that seemed to draw in everything around them. She didn't move, except to turn her head toward me, slowly and deliberately. Her body stayed tucked under the covers, as though she were only half there. Her gaze locked onto mine, and in that moment, a wave of icy terror washed over me. I ran. I sprinted down the stairs, heart pounding, refusing to look back. When I reached the safety of the living room, I begged my dad not to make me go back upstairs. He looked at me with concern, and though he didn't fully understand, something in my voice must have convinced him. For the rest of the weekend, I slept outside in a camping tent he set up in the backyard. Even now, at 23 years old, the memory is as vivid as if it happened yesterday. I can still see her face, those impossibly large eyes, the way she turned her head as though waiting for something. If it were just my imagination, surely the memory would have faded by now. But it hasn't. It lingers, sharp and clear, like a nightmare that refuses to end.
Story 4. Mirror and the Ghost.
Working on ships, especially older ones, you hear a lot of strange stories. 4 years ago, during a South American season, I spent a lot of time with the Brazilian crew members. They were fun, easygoing people, and one of them was the gift shop manager. He would often rant about how lazy his team was and how they kept trying to avoid work. claiming they saw a little girl running around the gift shop. One night, we were having coffee with the head of the photography department, and he was extra irritated, talking about how he'd have to do a few extra hours of work because of his team. In the middle of the night, I received a call from the photography manager. She told me our friend was in her cabin, crying and shivering. I rushed over, thinking maybe he'd gotten some bad news from home or something serious had happened. When I arrived, it turned out that he had been working in his office, which was near a large mirror covering most of the wall in the clothes section. After hearing giggling, he looked up and saw the shadow of a child in the reflection. The girl seemed to be leaning forward, peeking through the door as if she was trying to hide. He said he jumped up and ran out, hearing the giggling and the sounds of tiny feet running through the shop and into the casino on the same day. I'm not really into paranormal stuff, but the next day I mentioned this incident to my boss. She told me something chilling. About 20 years ago, a little girl had been with her parents coming out of the theatre. She ran ahead through the gift shop and into the casino. She eventually came out into the atrium, which had a large drop with glass lifts that go from deck 12 to deck 5, a pretty steep fall. The girl leaned over the railing to look down, lost her balance and fell, tragically breaking her neck on impact. Apparently this is a common sighting, both in the gift shop and in the casino.
Story 5. Faceless Figure.
I was working at a summer camp in the Pacific Northwest one year. On the second or third night there, I was jogging alone back from the staff campfire to the cabin where the campers and my co-counselor were sleeping. I was walking through this big grassy area that had tall reeds separating it from the shoreline of the Puget Sound. It was probably around 2 a.m. and the full moon lit up the night. As I was jogging, I noticed something, or someone in the reeds. It looked like a person wearing a white gown, but it had no face, just long hair hanging down. I only noticed it because, as I got closer, it suddenly stood up from a crouched position, backed up in a jerky, unnatural way, and crouched down again. It was still there, crouching, as if waiting for something. Its movements were not human. I froze. My knees gave out, and I felt an overwhelming flood of fear. I tried to run, but my legs refused to work. Panicking, I crawled and scrambled toward the cabin on all fours. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, just gasps of terror. When I finally reached the cabin, I fumbled with the doorknob, my hands shaking uncontrollably, until I managed to get inside. I slammed the door shut and stood there, trembling and listening. I did not hear anything after that, but I barely slept that night. At some point, I started laughing to myself, thinking, oh, it must have been one of the campers out there using the bathroom. I laughed hysterically for about 20 minutes, almost convincing myself it was nothing before finally falling asleep. The next morning, I asked the campers if anyone had been out of the cabin the previous night. Every single one of them said they had stayed inside. None of them had gone out. This camp was specifically for non-religious, skeptical staff and campers, and I still consider myself a skeptic. But to this day, I have no explanation for what I saw that night. It still terrifies me just to think about it.
Story 6. Woman Beside My Bed.
When I was 6 years old, something happened that has haunted me for decades. I was sound asleep in my bed, wrapped in the kind of innocence that only childhood can bring. But that night, the ordinary became something else entirely. I woke up suddenly not because of a noise, but because of a sensation. A shift. The mattress beside me dipped, as though someone was lying down. Confused, I opened my eyes, expecting to see one of my parents or perhaps a sibling. Instead, I saw her. A woman I had never seen before was lying beside me. She did not look frightening. She appeared like an ordinary adult woman, but her presence was unsettling. This was a stranger in my bed. My instinct was to scream, but before I could, she lifted a trembling finger to her lips. Her eyes, wide with terror, silently pleaded for me to remain quiet. Her expression was not just fearful, it was desperate. I froze, caught between her unspoken request and the raw terror building inside me. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and her lips quivered as if she wanted to speak but could not. Then, instinct took over, and I screamed with every ounce of strength in my small body. Footsteps thundered down the hall as my parents rushed to my room. The woman did not react to the commotion. She just stared at me, her expression a mix of sadness and something deeper, something that resembled regret. As soon as the bedroom light flicked on, she was gone. Not in a slow fade or with some dramatic disappearance, she was simply not there anymore. My parents searched the room thoroughly, but there was no trace of her. That night, I could not sleep in my own room. I stayed in my parents' bed, clutching my mother's hand tightly, as if it could shield me from the lingering sadness and fear. Even now, the memory of her haunted eyes stays with me. She did not seem malicious, but her presence carried an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Over the years, I have had other encounters with strange figures, but none left me with the same deep and unshakable sadness. What did she want? Why did she choose me? These questions remain unanswered, and the memory of that night remains vivid and chilling, as if it happened only yesterday.
Story 7. The Bunk Bed Visitor.
When I was about 14 years old, I stayed over at my friend's house. He had bunk beds, and I chose the top bunk. We went to sleep as usual, but that night, I had the most terrifying dream of my life. In the dream, I saw a hooded man standing in the doorway of the room. He walked in slowly and stood silently, staring at the two of us in our beds. When his gaze turned toward me, I was overwhelmed by a chilling coldness that seemed to pierce through my entire body. My stomach churned and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I wanted to scream or call for help, but I was too afraid to draw attention to myself, so I remained completely silent. The hooded man stepped closer to my friend, who was sleeping on the bottom bunk. He leaned down toward him, and though I was terrified for my friend, I also felt an awful sense of relief that the figure's focus was not on me. That relief quickly turned into shame for my own cowardice. Suddenly, the figure emitted a deep, guttural noise, an otherworldly rumbling sound that grew louder and louder until it felt like my ears might burst. I remember hoping the noise would wake my friend's parents, but at the same time, I had a dreadful feeling that we were completely isolated, trapped in the room with this terrifying presence. As the noise reached an unbearable pitch, something even more horrifying happened. A swarm of insects began pouring out of the hooded figure's shadowed face. The room quickly filled with the buzzing creatures, flying chaotically in every direction. Some of them brushed against my face, but I was paralyzed with fear, unable to swat them away. The swarm grew thicker and thicker until the entire room was filled with the sound and sensation of buzzing insects. I do not remember what happened next, but I must have passed out. The next morning, as we were having breakfast, my friend's father casually asked if we had slept well. I told him I had a terrible nightmare that left me shaken. My friend chimed in, saying he also had a nightmare. Then things took an even stranger turn. My friend said his nightmare involved thousands of insects crawling all over him. When I described my dream, we both froze, realizing how eerily connected our experiences were. Not long after, my friend's family moved to a new house. To be honest, I was relieved because I knew I could never bring myself to sleep there again.
Story 8. Skeptic meets the paranormal.
My dad used to work at a haunted house, a creaky, weathered mansion known for its unsettling history and eerie atmosphere. The owners thought that adding a ghost story to the mix would attract more visitors, so they decided to hire a medium to explore the property. My dad, ever the practical man, did not believe in the supernatural but went along with the idea to boost business. The medium arrived late in the afternoon as a storm brewed on the horizon. She was an older woman with piercing, unblinking eyes, her presence making even the most skeptical staff members uneasy. My dad led her through the dimly lit hallways, her steps pausing occasionally, as though she were listening to something faint yet deliberate. Halfway through the tour, she stopped suddenly in the grand hallway. Her head tilted slightly, and a strange expression crossed her face. "Are you missing tools?" she asked, her voice calm but unnervingly serious. Surprised, my dad admitted that he was missing several tools, including a hammer that had mysteriously vanished months ago. The medium nodded knowingly. "An old woman passed away upstairs years ago. She does not like intrusions. She has your hammer." The air seemed to grow heavier, and even my skeptical dad felt an involuntary chill creep down his spine. Nervously, he chuckled and jokingly asked the spirit to return the hammer. Though he doubted anything would happen, the medium simply gave him a quiet, knowing look and resumed the tour. The next morning, my dad went to the tool shed, and there it was, the missing hammer, lying neatly on the work table. It looked untouched, as though it had never been gone. He froze in place, the room suddenly feeling colder, and an eerie sensation washed over him, though he tried to rationalize what he saw. The hair on his arms stood on end, and he could not shake the feeling of being watched. Taking the medium's advice, my dad placed a small bouquet of flowers on the staircase leading to the upper floor, a gesture of peace for the unseen occupant. From that day forward, no tools went missing again. Yet, on quiet nights, faint footsteps could still be heard echoing upstairs, and the sensation of unseen eyes remained. Eventually, my dad left the haunted house job, but he never spoke lightly of ghosts again. The returned hammer became a quiet reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved.
Story 9. Shadow that walked away.
One day, my wife came home while we were living in an apartment in Midtown. It was about 10 in the night, and I was taking the trash to the dumpster in the alley behind my complex. The complex had only 6 two-story apartments, each with its front door facing south. We lived in apartment 5. When you open the door, there is a small raised landing where you would put a welcome mat. After stepping off the landing, You're on a walkway with two directions to go because a very tall wooden fence separates the complex from the large house next door. If you turn right and walk down past apartments 4 through 1, you run into a gate. Passing through the gate, you're now on one of the main streets in Midtown. If you turn left coming out of the apartment, you would pass apartment 6, then the laundry room, and immediately reach a wrought iron gate. On the other side of this gate is the dumpster. The distance from my door to the dumpster is very short, and with nothing obstructing your view, you can see from the dumpster all the way down the length of the walkway to the gate at the other end of the complex. The entire area was well lit. Every unit would turn on their front porch light every night, and there was a street light right where the dumpster is, and one right on the other side of the street side gate. This made it easy to see when my wife opened the gate and headed up the walkway towards our apartment. I waved at her but have no idea how she didn't see me. I thought about yelling, but didn't want to scare her or startle the neighbors. I had finished emptying the garbage, so I started walking the short distance to her. As I was walking up, I saw the door to our apartment open. I figured she had opened it, but it was dark, so I didn't actually see her do it. Then she leaned in, and I could hear her calling my name. But she wouldn't walk into the apartment, our own apartment, so I thought, why not just walk in? When I got behind her and said hi, she became frantic, asking, "How did you do that? How did you get back outside?" I explained that I'd been at the dumpster emptying the trash. She interrupted me and said, "No, you opened the door for me and walked upstairs. I called after you, and you turned your head and looked at me, but didn't say anything and just kept walking." She then started crying. I searched the apartment and found nothing. We moved about 6 months later to the house we're at now. Shortly after we moved in, my wife thought she saw me walk past the windows that look into the backyard from the kitchen, but it wasn't me. Again, she said it looked just like me. The figure walked all the way around the house before disappearing. Then she realized I was in the bedroom.
Story 10. Someone else living my life.
When I was in high school, I worked as a courtesy clerk at Albertsons. People were always telling me that they saw me somewhere in town when I wasn't actually there. One day when I got out of class at the end of the school day, I had to go straight to work. I wouldn't get home until just after 9 p.m. So I walked in just after 9 at night and said hi people to my mom and my sisters. They all looked confused. My mom asked me where I had been coming from. I told her I had been at work. My mom and my older sister both said, "No, you haven't. You came in hours ago," said hi people, and went upstairs. I said, "No, I didn't. I haven't been home since I left at 7 in the morning." So all 4 of us went upstairs to my room to see who had come home. My door was closed. I usually leave it open. The light was on, and the television was on. I opened the door. No one was there. But wait, it gets weirder. In high school, we had a secondary school called the Skill Center. It was a place that had a collection of vocational classes you could take. For instance, I took TV broadcasting, web design, and forestry. One day I was waiting for the bus to leave the Skill Center after my broadcasting class, and a teacher I had never met ran up to me and said, "Zushiba, you need to come back to class." I had never been in her class, but apparently I had been missing for the last few sessions. I tried to explain that I wasn't in her class, but she seemed to know who I was. So she took me to the office, thinking I was ditching. We went in, and I told the office clerk my name. She looked me up, and sure enough, there I was in broadcasting, just like I had said. But there I was, under my stepdad's last name in her class. I went by both names, so it was a bit confusing, but both names were relatively unique. So it's not like there would have been a random person who looked just like me in her class. It's just extremely unlikely. I had been in her class for the entire semester until I mysteriously stopped showing up. I had turned in work and everything, even had my signature on it. One day, this doppelganger simply stopped showing up. No one ever saw him again.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.